Welcome back to Talking Europe, and we're back in Paris. We're going to continue, however, to look at the French elections and the impact they could have on the EU. I'm joined in studio by Italy's former Prime Minister, currently President of the European think tank, the Jacques Delors Institute, and Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs, Sciences Po, Mr. Enrico Letta. Thanks so much for your time and welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Tell me, first of all, Brussels clearly has a favourite in these presidential polls in France, but could the EU survive a Le Pen presidency?
No, I don't think that the European Union can survive with Marine Le Pen as president. This is why these elections in France are so important at the European level. They are almost a European election, but without we, the Italian or the Irish or the Spanish, able to vote. In the hands of the French voters, there's the destiny of the European Union, because we never had such an influential national election like this one, because it's France, but because also of the system is a presidential election, so without the nuance of the typical parliamentarian election, and because the two candidates in the second round, they are the most Europhile and the most Europhobe. So two completely different directions for Europe.
And quite a different reaction from those Brussels institutions than we're used to, or even EU leaders in general. There was pretty much an audible sigh of relief after the first round. Tweets and calls of congratulations from the President of the EU Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, from Irish, Belgian heads of states, ministers in Germany, all voicing support for one of the candidates, Emmanuel Macron. EU Foreign Policy Chief Federica Mogherini was even asked to explain her tweet supporting him when she referred to Macron as the hope of a generation. On Monday, she was in Russia, where Russian journalists said, well, hang on a minute, if Russia did the same and described either of the candidates as the hope of the generation, wouldn't they be accused of interfering in national affairs? Here's how Federica Mogherini reacted.
So the European Union is made of us Europeans, including our French friends that voted yesterday night. That's why it was only natural for me to comment and to welcome the fact that putting together the two flags, I would have commented in the same manner if they were appearing in any other rally or political meeting yesterday night. Putting together the two flags sends exactly the right message, both to the French people and to the European Union as such, that we have a common responsibility to make our union work and deliver for our people, because the European Union doesn't exist without the Europeans.
So, Mr. Letta, Mogherini there saying, well, it's really the EU flags that made her so joyously happy on Sunday evening. But how do you react to this reaction from EU institutions and EU heads of state? Is it acceptable?
But I think it's normal. The European Union was close to the death in the year 2016. We had Brexit first, then Trump, two big challenges, and the idea that the European Union and the idea of a European integration is game over. And this is why today is decisive, because with Le Pen, it will be game over, definitely game over for Europe.
Because the National Front, historically, it's been very anti the EU, but the tone does seem to have changed in recent months and even years. Now saying it's not an automatic Frexit, she wants to open negotiations with the EU to look at France's relationship, something like we heard from David Cameron in the UK. Firstly, do you think the EU would be open to those kind of talks?
I think it's impossible for a very, very simple reason. The European Union is close to a crisis. And to avoid this crisis, it is absolutely necessary, it is needed to have a strong pro-European démarche, a strong pro-European boost from, I think, France and Germany. If we don't have this boost from France and Germany, I think the European Union will collapse. It is impossible to go ahead with business as usual. This is why, even if Marine Le Pen changes the tone, the subject, saying that we want just to discuss about our relationship, maybe a referendum, and so on and so on and so forth, that will be decisive, I think, for the worse, for the European Union, because for today it is absolutely necessary a pro-European initiative from France and Germany. Without this initiative, I think the business as usual will be the death of the European Union.
It's nearly too big a country to question that EU. However, Emmanuel Macron, should he, win these elections, he's very pro-EU. However, he says it definitely needs some massive reforms. And a lot of what he's putting on the table, forgive me if I'm wrong, but it looks like more talking is what's being suggested. There's democratic conventions, which is, 10 months of talks with European citizens to come up with really a concrete to-do list in terms of security, the economy, issues like migration. He wants to get everyone on board to make changes, but is the EU capable of change?
It's not bad to be ambitious. And I think Macron is very ambitious and is good for the European Union because we need to start a discussion on what will be the future of Europe. On security, on collective security, that is one of the most important issues in the period of terrorism, in the period of the crisis, defense. Trump saying that we don't want to continue like in the past, so the European Union has to be a little bit more strong alone. The social dimension, unemployment, growth, investments, the European Union needs to have a very ambitious agenda. This is why I think it's good for Europe, for the European Union, to have to hear these ideas from the French elections and from one candidate. And if Macron wins, I think for Europe it's time for a good relaunch. It is time for a good discussion on this new agenda in the future. Of
course, the French president would have power, if you like, to maybe get the EU moving. It sounds like a lot of responsibility.
Yes, but with Brexit, the role of France is growing. Without the UK, France will be and is today the only great military power in Europe. So France's role will be more important than the one France had in the past. And I will add also one point. We had, and we come from a decade in which the focus was economy and finance. And with this focus, it was clear that Germany took the leadership. Now the focus is more on security, identity, borders. On these topics, France has more opportunities to take leadership. This is why I think a Franco-German axe coupled with the others, my own country, Italy, has to be involved, and Spain too, and the others too, can relaunch the European Union with a multi-speed Europe, as I think, but for the best.
Well, you mentioned there the borders and all of that, and that's another issue, immigration, that these two candidates are quite far apart. Well, our reporter Josh Fardy gives us a quick look at how the two contenders measure up on the issue of foreigners in France.
It has always been one of the National Front's key talking points, but far-right French presidential candidate Marine Le Pen has only dedicated a handful of her 144 campaign promises to immigration. She says the answer is simple: the end of globalization.
The free circulation of people, the free circulation of capital, the free circulation of merchandise, and yes, the free circulation of delinquents, the free circulation of terrorists.
If elected, Le Pen's fight against globalization would start by taking France out of the Schengen zone. She also proposes reducing legal migration numbers, as well as ending the automatic right to family reunification and citizenship by birth. Le Pen's opponent, Emmanuel Macron, has attacked the return to hard national borders as illusory efficiency. He says immigration issues can be eased with greater collaboration between European countries.
Economically, socially, and in principle, immigration is a good thing, whatever the country.
Macron makes integration the most important priority of his proposals on immigration. Before the first round of the French presidential elections, Amnesty International published a report in France on the proposals of each candidate on their attitude towards refugees. They found that Emmanuel Macron's proposals aimed to speed up and simplify the asylum-seeking process, but was worryingly vague. Amnesty says that a Marine Le Pen presidency would put an end to the idea of seeking asylum altogether.
Mr. Letta, if we take that cold-hearted economic view of things for a moment, which side is right? Is it economically far worse or far better for France to keep its borders open and have immigrants arrive?
The borders are important today, but we think that the borders are more important, and we can close the borders in a very easy way. It is not true. For the borders, today there's a discussion that we have to have, and the discussion is, first of all, based on the separation for people between refugees, asylum seekers on the one hand, and migrants for economic reasons for the other hand. It is impossible to mix together, because without this separation, it will be impossible to give the right to those, the asylum seekers, who have the right to be accepted. Right? For the migration for economic reasons, it is absolutely normal, and we have to apply quotas, selectivity, and decisions like that. This is the first point. The other point is linked to the fact that we, the European Union, we need to have open borders for, first of all, trade, and second, for all the economic matters. To think that now we block and we stop globalization is exactly a slogan for the electoral campaign. The globalization process today is linked to the big digital progress. And this digital progress is impossible to stop it. It is a progress that we have to accompany. We have to be able to avoid any social negative consequences. And this is why the European Union has to work very hard on that.
Okay, so for globalization, borders are open, and it'll be impossible to close them again. But looking at that refugee question very briefly, the EU is totally failing on that. And there's no consequences for countries within the EU that aren't meeting international law on it. You know, if Le Pen, again, if she happens to be successful and she wants to say no, absolutely no to refugee or asylum seekers coming to France, she wouldn't be the first. Hungary has done it with no consequences.
She can't say no because the French constitution, like the Italian constitution, the Spanish constitution, they say that we are in a system in which our duty is to give...
The EU needs to step up on
the EU too. But the key point there is the fact that if we continue with the Dublin Treaty, the Dublin Treaty Dublin is a fantastic city, but the Dublin Treaty is a very bad treaty, because this treaty continues to say that there's an unbalanced situation between the countries in the first row, like Italy and Greece. But Italy and Greece, we have a terrible geographic situation. How can we save, or how can we manage the coast of these two countries? 100,000 kilometers, of course. It's impossible to work without a rebalancing of the situation between the first row countries and the rest of the European Union. This is why we can manage the situation only if the Treaty of Dublin is changed.
Okay, and you're hopeful that that's on the cards?
I hope, and is the only way, and I think Germany too is starting to understand.
Countries will start to rebel against that, perhaps. Well, we looked very briefly at the EU ministers and various heads of state support for Macron. Of course, there were nationalist politics across the EU voicing their support for Le Pen and her, record result in that first round. We had in the Netherlands Geert Wilders, and across in the UK Nigel Farage saying, it was a win for nationalism. Nigel Farage, of course, and Brexit, also a large question of the borders in that vote. We're having that meeting of the 27 heads of state in Brussels on Saturday, looking at the guidelines for the Brexit negotiations. But is Brexit definitely going to happen?
I don't know, because it's very complicated to predict. I think the British voters, they decided to have Brexit, but Brexit will be very complicated. Now I think even Theresa May is starting to understand how complicated it is. I think that the decision to call for early election was a decision that shows weakness. Weakness because it's another way to continue this very political discussion without knowing that the topic today is a very concrete negotiation. On our hand, we have Michel Barnier, who is working very hard and very well, I would say, on the topics. On the other side, we are waiting for concrete proposals. And what is clear is that the single market for us is united. People, money, and trade. You can't separate people from money and services.
Indeed, it seems that this is the one question that the EU seems to be united as a bloc. Do you expect that to last throughout those Brexit negotiations?
Until now, I think the European Union showed a great unity, and it was not expected. It's a good news.
Okay, well, we're going to have to, of course, wait and see how that all unfolds, Mr. Letta. Thank you so much for your time and joining us here. Thanks also, of course, to you at home for having watched. That brings us to the end of this edition of Talking Europe.